This video is about using the scanner to process complex files of input. So imagine we've been asked to solve this problem. We've got an input file here called hours.txt, and each line of that file contains a record of input about a person at a company, let's say. And so the first thing on each line is the employee's ID number, and the second thing on the line is the person's name. And then after that, each of these things, each of these remaining tokens is a day that the person worked at the company, and this is how many hours the person put in that day of work. And so if you look carefully, the number of these tokens is not the same. On this first line here, Susan worked 4 different days this week, and Brad here and Jen here both worked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days in the week. So you shouldn't make any assumptions about exactly how many days the employee worked. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to write a program that will read that file and print some output of each person's total hours and the number of hours they worked per day on average. Okay, well, we can get started on that, and we'll probably run into some of the difficulties along the way. The first thing that we need to do is open up a scanner to read this file. I've already got the file hours.txt here, and I've saved it in the same folder as my hours worked program that we're working on here today. So I'm going to make a scanner to read from this file. So scanner input, that will be a new scanner that reads from the new file named hours.txt. And when we make a scanner, of course, we have to put this throws clause on our main method, or else the program won't compile. So we say throws file not found exception. Okay, now that we've got the scanner, using the token-based processing that we've used so far, we could look at some of these tokens on each of the lines here. So maybe what we'll do is we'll start with the ID number and then the name, and then we'll think about these hours tokens here. So maybe we could say that the ID number is the next int from the console, and the person's name is the next string from the console. And recall that the way to read a string token is just to say next. And these tokens here about the hours worked each day, we don't know exactly how many of those there are. So maybe what we could tell the scanner is let's keep reading these as long as there's another double, a real number, waiting to be read. So maybe we could say something like while the scanner input has a next double. We've been learning about checking for user input using these hasNext methods. So while there is a next double, what do we want to do with it? Well, we want to add them all up so that we can say how many hours the person worked total. So maybe we could do something like a cumulative sum here, basically. So this is a sum of the hours worked. Let's make a variable out here called total hours. Set that to 0. And then each time we read a number here, we could say something like, let's add that to the total. Total hours plus equals the next double from the scanner. Okay. And the other thing we need to do is we need to know how many, so that's going to give us the total hours, but we need to know how many hours per day the person worked. Well, in order to know how many hours per day, we have to divide the total by, in this case, there were 5 days, so 39.5 divided by 5. In order to know how many doubles we read, we need to count them. So as we're reading them here, we need to count the number of times that loop spins. So maybe we could say something like int days equals 0, and each time we read an int, we'll do days plus plus. So that'll count the number of days. Okay, so this is all the code for processing a single employee here, and it seems like we want to do that for all of the employees in the file here. So maybe what we could do is wrap all of this code in an outer loop that says while there is another employee to process, let's do all of this. So this code is to process one employee. And maybe we could say while there is another employee to process, let's do all of this. So what's the test here? Well, maybe we could say as long as there's more data in the file, as long as there's more to be read, then we will keep doing this inner code here. So maybe we'll say while the input has a next token in it, we will do that. Okay, well, let's try to compile and run that program for a second. And I think we're going to have a program that does some good things, but it may not be quite right. What do we have here? We have an input mismatch exception. Our program crashed. So why did the program do that? Well, let's look at the input file for a second here again. We read the ID, we read the name, we read the hours. So what's going on? Where did this error occur? Well, it started in our program on line 24. So line 24 is right here. The input next int. So that's this one. Oh, you know what we've forgotten to do is we have to print out the information about each employee. That's the other important thing that this program is doing. It's hard to tell what the error is if we don't see that output on the screen. So what we're supposed to do is after we add up all the hours for each person, we're supposed to print a message like Susan worked 31.4 hours. Seems like after we're done adding up all of these hour tokens here, maybe that's the place we would print this message. Let's add that println in. Maybe that'll help us figure out this bug. So we need to print something like that. So we'll say system out println the person's name plus how many hours they worked. Total hours, and then in parentheses we'll print the number per day. So per day, that means the total hours divided by the days. There we go. So let's try to run this program one more time. Maybe we'll see what's going on. Now we get a single println before that crash occurs, and it says Susan worked 487.4 hours. Well, she was supposed to work 31.4 hours, and we got 487.4 hours. What's going on there? What's the problem? Well, if you do some quick math on these two numbers, the difference between those two numbers is 456. Where's 456? Well, 456 is Brad's ID number in the file. And why would that be the difference between these values? And we also get this crash right after that. Well, what's going on here is as we're reading the input from the file, let's walk through the code for a second. It says we will read the int ID number as the next int from the scanner. That's line 24 there. So we read this int. Now it says to read the name on line 25, so we read that. We store it as name. Now that the scanner cursor is sort of here at the start of this 12.5 token, now we do this loop. While there is a next double, I'm going to read and read and read and read. Now, one thing that's important to understand about the scanner is it can treat an integer as a double as well. So if the next token is just a series of numbers, it can read that as a double. Another thing to remember is that when you're reading tokens like this, it doesn't care much about white space, including line breaks. So when the scanner is sitting here at the end of this line and we ask it, do you have a next double? It peeks ahead at the next token. It says, well, the next token is 456. Yes, I can read that as a double. And so actually our loop goes ahead and reads the 456 and adds it to Susan's total hours, which is why she seemed to work 487 hours here. And that's no good. Certainly that makes her total way off, but it does something even worse in terms of our program, which is the next time the program loop wraps around to read the next person, Brad, our program is expecting the scanner to be here at the start of the second line, but really the scanner is actually here at the start of Brad's name because we already read the 456. So what happens is when we try to say int ID equals input.nextInt, it tries to read the word Brad as though Brad were an int, and so that doesn't work. That's why our program produces this input mismatch error. So this is bad. What we've encountered is a problem where we want to utilize certain aspects of token-based file processing, like breaking apart these doubles and adding them to a sum. But we also want to consider the lines as well, because Susan's data is only the data on this line, Brad's data is only the data on this line, and so on. So really this problem is not a pure token problem, and it's not purely a line problem either. So we have to use a hybrid approach to solve it. So it's important to recall the line-based scanner methods, next line and has next line. So when we're solving line-based scanning problems, we have a while loop that repeats as long as the scanner has more lines, and then as long as it does that, we read a line at a time and process the line. So, well, what if we tried to turn this into a line-based problem? We could read each line at a time, but then the problem is we want to look at the contents of each line. We want to break apart the contents of each line to add up the hours and so forth. How do you do that? Well, a scanner can tokenize the contents of a string. And that can be a very useful thing. So imagine you have a string here with these tokens in it. If you made a scanner on that string, then if you ask the scanner for the next int, it would start its cursor at the beginning of the string and it would read an int from the string and return that int to you, 15. If you then called next double, it would try to read the next token from the string as a double. In this case, that's 3.2. If you called next on it, it would try to read the next token as a string, a substring, and it would return the string hello. So if you take these two ideas and put them together, the idea of a line-based scanner input from a file and the idea of string scanning, you can combine those into a hybrid approach where you tokenize each line of a file. You make the scanner on the overall file, you read the lines one at a time, and then you make a scanner, a second scanner, that reads the contents of that line, that breaks apart the contents of that line. And that's a crucial idea for us to solve this problem. So if I go back to the code that we're working on, here's what I want to do. Instead of making my overall loop be a hasNext loop, let's make this into a hasNext line loop. And as we read the input, we're going to read it one line at a time. We're going to say, I want to read the next line from the input. What do I want to do with this line? Well, let's talk about what are the contents of that line for a second. That line is going to have this, for example, as its contents. So you could think of that as these being the contents of the line, the first time that the program goes through this loop. So now I want to read the 1, 2, 3 out of the line, and I want to read the Susan name out of the line, and so on. So what I'll do is I'll make a scanner to scan the contents of that line. I'll say scanner line scan is a new scanner that reads its data from the line. Now it's important to understand that line and line scan are two separate variables. So if we want to break apart the contents, we talk to line scan, not to line directly. So here's what we do. Instead of reading the int here from the input from the file, we'll read it from the line scanner. Same thing with all these other reading operations. We'll read the name from the line scanner. We'll read the hours from the line scanner. So we'll say line scan.nextDouble. All of these next calls here, we would change them to say line scan instead of input. And now once we're done with all of that, the nice thing about it is the line scanner only scans up to this point. That's all the data it has to look at. It's not able to go down and break into that next line of input and ruin it. So hopefully that'll solve our problem with this 487 business reading into the next line of input. So let's try that out and see what we get. If I compile and run this, it says no such element exception on line 32. I think the problem here, this is kind of a common bug. I think I have failed to change one of these to line scan. So you have to be careful. I'm reading these doubles from the line, not from the overall input file scanner anymore. So it's a pretty common bug. If you forget to change one of these, you can get one of those kind of errors in your program. So maybe now we've fixed it. So here we go. We've got Susan. These numbers look a lot more reasonable now. 31.4, 7.85, 36.8. Looks like I've solved the problem. Of course, I haven't got it rounding the way the expected output does. I could just change the println here at the bottom to be a printf statement or something if I wanted to round the numbers. I'll leave that as an exercise for you. But it looks like I've solved the problem now. Well, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at a variation of the problem, which is where we would actually make it search for a person by ID. And rather than listing every employee's hours, it would only show just that one employee's. And of course, if we type an ID that isn't found in the file, then I want to print a message that says ID not found. Okay, well, how do I add that to the code? Let's think about that for a second. If I want to prompt the user to enter an ID, I'm going to need yet another scanner which will ask the user whose ID they're searching for. So maybe here I could make a scanner for the console, reads from system in, and I would ask the user enter an ID. So let's print that prompt message to the user, enter an ID. And now I'll read the ID. So this is the desired ID. and that's from the console. I want to read an int. Okay, now that I've got this desired ID, what I'd like to do is I'd only like to process all of this stuff here if the ID on this line is the person I'm looking for. So if the line I'm on has an ID of 123 and the desired ID is 123, I want to print all this information about that person. So basically what you can do is here, once you read the ID from the line scanner, you can say, well, if the ID that I just read is equal to the desired ID that I'm looking for, then I'll do all of this. And otherwise, I'll just not bother to tokenize the rest of the line. I don't need to look at all that if I don't want to. The println isn't necessary, and all this other processing isn't necessary. So let's try that out for a second. We've got an ID that we're looking for, and we're only going to print if we find that ID. So let's type 456, and it prints Brad's hours. And if you remember that Brad was the person with ID 456, so that looks like that's doing something reasonable there. Let's run it again with a different number. How about 123? That prints Susan hours, and Susan was the person with ID of 123. So it looks like it's working. There's just one thing missing, which is, if we type some crazy ID that's not in the file, right now the program prints nothing. So a lot of students actually have trouble adding this last piece to the program, the piece that's printing this ID not found message. Well, basically the trick here is we need to figure out whether we matched anyone or not, and if we didn't match anyone, we want to print that message. Now there's a couple of wrong ways to do that. One classic wrong way to do it is to say, well, if this line is the ID I'm looking for, then I'll do all this processing. But if it's not, like otherwise, else, this is not the person I'm looking for. So I will print that message. I'll print ID whatever not found. System out println ID number desired ID not found. This actually is not a correct solution. Maybe you can already see what's wrong with that. If I run it again, here's what I'll see. I'll type in some crazy ID. It prints it 3 times, prints that error message 3 times. I'll run it again and I'll type a number that is in the file, and it prints the not found message twice and Brad's hours once. So why is it doing that? Well, the reason that that's happening is because every single line that it reads from the file, it's checking to see, is that the desired number? And if it's not, it's printing this error message, and every single line except for one is not going to be the desired number. So you're going to print this message for every single line that doesn't match, and that's not what you want to do. So really what we need to remember is, did we ever see it once? And only then at the very end of the program should we potentially print this error message. So I like to tell students, if you don't want something to happen many times, you shouldn't put it in a loop. So this message will never be something that I want to print more than once. So therefore the println to print that message shouldn't be inside of a loop. I think what we want to do is we want to remember if we ever found the person we were searching for. So why don't I say something like using a Boolean flag. I'll say Boolean found equals false. And this variable will store, have I found the person that I'm looking for, the person with this desired ID number. So I set it to false because initially I have not seen that person. But if I ever find the desired ID that I'm looking for, I'll say, yes, I did find the person I was looking for. I found them. And now, down here, I don't really want this else statement anymore. So now, using that Boolean flag, can I tell whether to print the message at the end of the program? Well, yeah, if I just check this found flag, I can basically go down here. This is just outside of the while loop here, and I'll say if found is false, that means I never found the person I was looking for, so I'll print this message. A shorter way of saying found equals false would be just to write if not found. If the negation of found is true, then I'll print that message. Let's try this and see what we get. I'll run it and I'll type in 456. That's a person who is in the file. I get Brad's hours. I'll run the program again. I'll type a number that's not in the file. it prints the not found message just the way we want it. So that's our program.